right, so I have a really exciting panel today of people I'm just really excited to talk to. So we're going to try and keep this lively for you all because I know everyone's a little tired of all the Zooms all the time. But I am joined today by three amazing writers, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves. But take it away, Doug.
Hi, I'm Doug Swanson. My book, Cult of Glory, The Bold and Brutal History of the Texas Rangers, came out in June. And I think this is my 5th or 6th Mayborn, so happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Michael Fletcher. I'm a writer with ESPN, former Washington Post reporter, before then a reporter at the Baltimore Sun, and this is my first Mayborn.
Good to have you, Michael.
Hi guys, Jamie Thompson here. I'm a freelance writer based in Bethesda, Maryland. Just released my first book called Standoff, Race, Policing, and a Deadly Assault That Gripped a Nation.
And I'm Carrie Aspinwall with the Marshall Project, formerly of the Dallas Morning News. So we have some serious Dallas Morning News DNA on this panel here at the Mayborn. DMN DNA, I like to call it. So it's really lovely to have you guys here. I was really excited when the Mayborn chose this topic for the conference and also for this panel because it's something we're very passionate about, the Marshall Project, as you might have guessed. I am filling in at the last minute for Skip Hollinsworth, who's off reporting, but we wanted to talk today about, basically we're talking about the collision of race, culture, and justice, or what we call injustice often at the Marshall Project. And, you know, man, it's hard every day. Like I woke up to the news this morning of yet another officer involved shooting in Texas, Wolf City, Texas, a tiny town. This time they have actually already arrested the police officer, but we know that's not how that usually goes. So Michael, I was reading back over something that you wrote this summer, and it really just hit hard with everything going on with this, and I think it's very pertinent for our panel. I want you to kick us off. You wrote an essay, and the lead was, what kind of a country sees Black Lives Matter as a radical idea and Black suffering and death as unremarkable? And that just really stuck with me with the events of the day. So I wanted you to, if you could kind of kick us off with that idea, because you know, I know this, hear it from folks all the time. We see these videos, we see these deaths, and it just wears on you.
No, it absolutely does. And, you know, this is something like, you know, I've been in journalism a long time, and for a long time and for too long, we sort of took for granted kind of all the disproportion we see, you know, the disproportion in police violence and who it was directed at. The disproportion in street violence and where it occurred, and kind of our reaction as a society to all of this. And it just felt like, you know, I think somehow there's this collective sense of that's just how things are, and maybe how they, you know, how they're meant to be, maybe. And I've always rejected that. And finally, I think the country has rejected that idea. And when you look back, and that's been one good thing about this moment, I think it's caused us all to kind of reflect on kind of where we've been in this country racially, and what's been accepted and tolerated as kind of the norm, if you will. And we're now re-examining those norms and looking back and trying to, you know, and deciding that many things are unacceptable and we can actually change them, we can do something about them. You mentioned a police officer being arrested for a police shooting. And
rare occurrence, but yeah.
More and more, right? But 5 years ago, I couldn't have said that. So feels like we're on some kind of track toward at least a greater recognition of kind of, or a new understanding of our reality, if you will.
This brings us to Doug. We're going to take it all the way back to some history because Doug has dug deep into the history of the Texas Rangers. And this is something we talk a lot about, the Marshall Project, and there's been a lot of good work done in this area. There's sort of racial history, the ugly kind of racist history of a lot of these law enforcement organizations, especially in the South. If you've ever been to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, the lynching memorial, as a lot of people know, it's really just, you know, socks you in the gut, and everyone's sobbing in there because there is this tremendous tie-in between the old law and order, you know, culture in Texas and the states I grew up in, Oklahoma. And it's interesting. So Doug has this book that really kind of dives deep into the history of the Texas Rangers and some troubling truths about it.
Yeah, and it's ironic that the sheriff's deputy who was arrested that we were just talking about, he was arrested by Texas Rangers, in fact.
They're doing the investigation.
Yeah, exactly. That's what they do now. They investigate police shootings. And the irony there is if you go back over the 197-year history of the Rangers, they have a terrible record of oppression, of murder, of just a general maltreatment of African Americans, Mexican Americans, and other minorities in the state. And I've said this before, they didn't invent police brutality, but they perfected it along the Texas-Mexico border in the early 1900s, where, depending on your source, the Rangers either killed a few hundred Mexican Americans or a few thousand. But there's no doubt they had a reign of terror along the border.
So why do you think the mythology around them in Texas still persists? Like they just took the statue down at Love Field, right?
Right.
Of the one guy, but it's, then we got a baseball team named after him.
Right.
Were you nervous? You're going after like a sacred cow in Texas here. I think people are ready to hear it, but it's a tough one because a lot of people really buy into that myth of like, these are heroes. And not that they didn't do important things back in the day, but
Right.
the other side to it too.
Well, there were some heroic Rangers. We have to say that. There were some who were upstanding and honest and brave and all of that. But the myth has been there for a long time. Hollywood was a big part of that. And all these movies, hundreds of movies about the Rangers where they were almost always heroic. But also it's the Rangers and their supporters had a propaganda factory going for decades where they put forth this myth, this legend, and people ate it up because, we like these heroes. We like to hear these stories. And by people, I mean white people, because, you can still talk to people. There was always
another side. It just wasn't getting told.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And that's what's happening now, not just with the Rangers, but with all sorts of aspects of history. And it's more fair, but it's really more interesting. We're all writers here. And don't we love a story that's layered and complex rather than one that's one-dimensional? And that's what we're after.
Well, you just set me up perfectly to get into Jamie's book because this is a layered and complex story. And it's a very fascinating one because I moved to Dallas to work for the morning news 1 month after the ambush. Jamie's book is Standoff, and it's about this that happened in July 2016, right before I moved to Dallas. And Michael Johnson, who was upset about all of the Black men getting killed by police that summer, then ambushed Dallas police officers, killing 5 of them. And, very dramatic, wild story. We had an early version of her narrative in the morning news a couple years ago at Standoff, and now there's the book. You can read the whole story. But what I love about this is she goes, one, it's a very nuanced, complex story, and I love that. Larry's story she gets into, there was an excerpt, I think, published in D Magazine this month or last month. But it's very fascinating to me. It's always held a really interesting spot because one of the stories I began investigating when I first moved to Dallas was a very different story about Dallas police. Totally different side of the equation, not related incidents, but I always think about it in the context of what was going on with the police department that summer, because a month later, a different man died. And that's another story I'll get into in a bit about Tony Timpa, but talk about Standoff and your book and all the work you've done about the ambush. And tell us about Larry. What do we learn from Larry and his story?
Sure. So as you mentioned, the book is very narrowly focused on this one night. But what I tried to do was to really pull in different characters and people and really tell what happened from their particular point of view. So there's a Black crisis negotiator who spends a lot of hours talking to the gunman. There's a trauma surgeon who was on duty at the hospital. There's a profile of a protester. And I think the negotiator, Larry Gordon, is kind of the heart and soul of the book. He runs into the building that night. A gunman, as you mentioned, showed up in downtown Dallas, heavily armed, shoots and kills 5 cops. SWAT team converges on this community college where the gunman is hiding. And their job is to essentially disable him, take him out in some way before he can kill anyone else. And Larry Gordon is one of the lead crisis negotiators. So he ends up spending the evening about 20, 30 yards away from this armed gunman, and he's got to start talking to him. He's come in the building prepared to die, prepared for a gunfight, and he has to sort of just start talking to the guy. And as the night goes on, they have some really interesting conversations. Larry's one of the few Black officers on the SWAT team, and he has been hearing a lot of the things that the gunman is talking about. He's been having these same conversations with his relatives, with his friends. And so he has some really complicated feelings about these questions of race and policing. And it gets into that as you hear their conversations on the hallway. And sort of he ends up being sort of the anchor of the book, and you follow them through the evening.
Yeah, well, I love Larry's story, and I think it's so interesting because it was like the title or one of the subtitles of the D magazine piece, too black to be blue, too blue to be black. And it's something he really struggles with. And it is an interesting story in the context of DPD because they had a Black female police chief. They had a Black chief before that. They do have some diversity because it is a way that a lot of people earn a good living, but it is complicated. And that's what I always think about, the context of what happened that summer with Micah Johnson and those guys. And then a month later, when I got there, suddenly I was investigating, hey, this guy got killed in this interaction. And I initially didn't know the level of the police involvement. We just knew that he called 911. Tony Tempa was a man, and we only knew his name as Tony. So I started investigating a tip about this man who had died. And it took me about a year to get, because they won't cough up the records in Texas if there's an ongoing investigation. They still haven't coughed up some of the records from what happened with Micah that night. I imagine you've had a real battle to get behind that. But Tony, we found out that he called 911 for help. He was high on drugs, and he was already handcuffed when police arrived, and they pinned him to the ground, and basically he suffocated and died on the spot there. And they tried to cover up a lot of stuff about what happened that night. And the weird thing about the story is that Tony is a white man, and this is one of the few times this has happened. And it always makes me think when these stories come out, because the weird fact of it is that every couple months, some weird blogger is trying to make a point about, see, it happens to white people too, and they shared the story, it recirculates, and my mentions blow up, and I'm like, this is not making the point you want it to make, because it's a man in crisis. So it's, again, this is a botched reaction to a mental health crisis that we see a lot of going on now within other incidents. It's just the unusual fact was that Tony happened to be a white guy. But every time I always think about the difference the role the videos play. Because people, white folks didn't believe us when we first ran Tony's story. They're like, well, he was on cocaine, how do you tell? There were a lot of Black people who reacted to it differently on social media. They're like, this is a tragedy, this is not right, they need to tell the truth. Because they knew, I think their experience was way different. They're like, see, we told y'all this is going on. And I think it's hard that it took the video of George Floyd's death to really kind of get the message through to a lot of people. Michael, do you think that George Floyd's death was really a major turning point? I know that this has been a big area of debate because some of the defund the police, I think there's a really good Times article about, there's a lot of momentum in Minneapolis about defund the police, and now that's kind of died down a little bit. So where do you think how obviously George Floyd's death sparked a lot of conversation, but where do you think this is going to spurn some real change, some real, possible evolution for us?
I think so, and I think part of it was, even when we've had video in the past, police video, and I think all the way back to people, I think always had questions, right? They would say, well, what happened, in the moments before that video started rolling, what led up to that? But in the case of Floyd, that 8 minutes, 46 seconds were just so excruciating, right? And I think people saw that, like, whatever he was doing before the video started rolling, couldn't explain what we were witnessing, during that period of time. So I think in that way, it kind of shocked people's conscience. And to Doug's point, you talk about the mythology around the Texas Rangers. We're dealing with mythology around the police generally, right? I mean, even in our profession, for many years, when you go to the police, every newspaper had a police beat, and kind of accept the police version of events, right? There'll be a police report, and that'll become the backbone for many a story that were written. On the big stories, you go out and do some reporting, but the kind of core narrative was always controlled by the police, right?
Yeah. So
the Floyd thing, I think, is, sort of chipped away, sort of like shattered in a way that credibility. So now what becomes of it? Is it defund the police? I don't know. Like as you point out in Minneapolis, that's already kind of falling apart. I live in Baltimore City, where along with police problems, you have a crime problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you have a murder problem on the street. So I don't think that many kind of, everyday taxpayers necessarily want the police defunded, at least in the sense of, totally sort of reimagined and remade and, recreated. I think they want to see, police sort of better regulated, better controlled. Like in the past, when you talked about, say, civilian review boards, I think a lot of the population kind of rolled their eyes. So, you don't get what these cops have to do. But I think that's been sort of broken through now. And I could be proven wrong, but I think the Floyd thing was a shock to this nation's conscience. I've never seen anything quite like it. It hasn't, at least in half a century in terms of the kind of reaction you've seen. Mm-hmm. And it's more than PR. There's a lot of PR involved, but I think it's more than that, where, people are corporate entities and kind of the mainstream of this country is, expressing a shock and horror and trying to make some kind of change.
This can go to all you guys, whoever wants to answer first, but talking about the mythology and talking about the legend, Michael made the very excellent point about the media has been a big part of that, one-sided narrative. Part of why I became an investigative reporter eventually is I had been a young crime reporter like that at a paper. And that was your job, to go and gather those little tidbits for the, blotter and all that. And then when I got to my first criminal case that I was really starting to look into and found a series of injustices, I kind of realized there's this whole other side that's not getting told. And it really kind of spurred me to do that. But true crime has become kind of a hot genre, as you all know. And these kind of deep dives into cases, into policing, TV series. I know you've written about The Wire, Michael. How do we navigate the very tricky line of telling a good story about these issues, about these cases, and exploiting somebody's pain? Because that is a tough one, right? Like there's a lot of these true crime things out there now, and some of them, they sometimes feel a little exploitative. So whoever wants to jump in, let's talk about that one.
I'll jump in. You sort of conjured some memories there. I think about like one of my first stories, maybe one of the first front page stories I had when it came to the Baltimore Sun. There had been a murder of a doctor. He might have even done house calls back in those days. Somehow, I can't remember the circumstances now, maybe it was a robbery, but he was murdered. And, there I was, in the newsroom, and I was assigned to cover this thing, and I had to go talk to his family, and I went to the house. And I was so nervous about that, and I felt like such an intruder on their, on their grief and their moment of, pain and all of that. But I went and, I was able to do it. And I went and talked to them, and it was interesting to me how open people were with me, how they really wanted to talk about this doctor and talk about what he had done and, talk about his life. And they didn't treat me like, maybe it'd be different now, but at the time they treated me like, like they welcomed me into their home. But, there's a lot, you really don't want to, you want to know the facts of, to the degree but you don't want to press too hard. You really have to hone your skills of listening. That's one thing I've tried to do as a reporter, spend a lot of time actually trying to hear what people are saying rather than listening just for my quote to fit the story I'm already writing in my head. So I think there's a big part of that. It just comes down to sort of basic sort of empathy and common sense at some level. But, again, you have to be careful though when you're doing these stories, like, where, who do you believe? Whose facts do you play up, right?
Yeah.
What narrative do you stick to? There was another case early in my career in Baltimore where I remember this one more vividly. I remember it was around Thanksgiving. I think I was working a Thanksgiving Day shift, and the kid had been murdered the day before. And he had, in those days, these Georgetown starter jackets were the big thing.
The starter jackets, yeah.
Stolen. I wrote this story, then ended up arresting two guys. And I didn't, I wasn't the cop reporter, so I didn't follow it all the way through, but I remember how we at the paper characterized these guys, like these villainous guys who did this. And it turns out, like, these guys were released from prison within the last few months because it turns out they were wrongfully convicted, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of it, the newspaper didn't convict them, but we certainly helped drive home that narrative to our reading public, like, that these guys, had done this awful deed and killed a kid over
starter jacket.
We really have to be careful in our job, and we don't have a lot of time. You have to turn those stories around. It's reality, but We have to find a way to listen and also always weigh and always judge and always try to be mindful of what we're doing.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, don't go into it with some preconceived notion. Don't try to become friends with anyone. I mean, I covered a horrible crime many, many years ago. I'm a lot older than you guys, but a boy had been kidnapped and murdered, and the family looked like the all-American family. So another reporter and I got in and did a long-term look at it, and that's what we thought going in. And it turned out they weren't the all-American family. They had lots of drug problems and bad associations and infidelities going on and wild parties. And at the same time, the cops were blowing the case too. So there was all sorts of bad information and bad behavior going around that we found only because we were able to spend about 2 or 3 months on the story, which by newspaper standards back then was a long, long time. But I guess that's the lesson I took away from it is, you know, keep an open mind and follow the trail. Don't go into it thinking, I know what the story is right now, and this is the one I'm going to pursue.
Who you think might be the bad guys might change quickly if you go in with a different, yeah.
Exactly.
I think too that I think we've all sort of throughout our career probably known that cops reporter who was so close with the cops that, and it's very important to have those kind of relationships to understand what's happening in your city. But I really feel like now as newspapers shrink, we're getting less quality cops reporting. You know, I feel like, you know, some of us who covered cops, like I remember starting out at St. Pete Times, like I went to the police station and read every single report every single morning, you know, of what was happening. You have a very clear idea, and doing weekly ride-alongs. Like you really see what the life is like, what the humor is like, what the policies are like in action. And I feel like, I do feel like that's missing a little bit now, when we don't know exactly what's happening inside police departments on the same kind of granular level that we used to. I think there's more broad stereotyping that happens about police in general. And so I think that it's important not to only be talking to police, but we can't let the police reporting really fade, I think, as much as it is, if we really want to understand what's happening, you know, inside those departments.
No, I know what you mean. I mean, that does worry me. You know, most of the papers that used to have several young, you know, police reporters of all ages who that was their full-time job to try and, you know, really report out on that. But they also had people in the courthouse.
Yeah.
So there's full-time. I remember that's how I learned how to do all this. There was the great court reporter at the Tulsa World, Bill Brown, who's my buddy. I still visit him in Tulsa when I go up. But he lived there. He lived at the courthouse, and you know, they would take pity on the young reporter, and you'd follow them around and figure out how to get stuff. So it's hard, you know. You want to do that, but so many things have been cut back now. So it's hard, and you hate to see it. But how do we, with all the changes and everything going on, you guys? How do we have a responsibility to do better? We've all talked about that. How do we do better? What can we do better with these limited resources? I mean, I know a lot of folks that are watching this are going to think, yeah, right, I know. But what is, you know, some advice or wisdom you can pass on through your many, many long projects that you've dealt with over the years, and just of how to do better and how to be better at this?
My thought would be, just to reiterate what I said before, is to really honestly try to be better listeners, right? To really try to hear what people are saying rather than, you know, selectively hearing what they're saying. Because I think that will bring us often to, you know, to Doug's point, it will kind of lead you to kind of that sweet spot of kind of nuance and layering and all of that around stories. Like, you know, I covered race relations for a number of years at the Washington Post, and it was interesting how people viewed race. They saw it as something that you couldn't do sort of real reporting about, you know, some ways. I mean, it was almost like you quote people and you just say stuff, you know, rather than, you know, going to, you know, to the economic record or going to, you know, sort of building a case or looking at what advocacy groups are doing and looking at sentencing disparities and all of that and criminal justice disparities. I mean, we really just have to remain open-minded. Don't wed ourselves too closely to any narrative. Obviously, you have to have a bit of a plan when you enter a story, but you have to always be open to changing that plan, adjusting that plan, and kind of, making the contours of that plan kind of match the reality you see. It's interesting to me when you talk to people, and when I talk to sort of, everyday people, and if they end up in the paper, right, they often feel like it's like, they're often astonished at what we choose to like focus on or, write about. And,
Wow.
and they're not going to always be right about that, but sometimes there's something to that, to maybe we didn't hear what they were saying when we were listening selectively. So I really try my best not to do that. And I know it's tough. Like when you have a deadline, you got to get it done. But when you get that opportunity, really try to broaden that lens, step back, and really look fresh at the landscape.
And I'd add to Michael's point, which I thought was really good, but I would add get the records, which, Carrie, you made a reference to that earlier, which is getting harder and harder, right?
It's so hard.
Yeah. But, once you get them, we've all been there, right? Where the story takes an extreme turn one way or another when you start to see it in black and white and you see the official version, or not the official version, but what's often the real version, and which doesn't quite agree with what you've been told sometimes.
Jamie, I
So I'd like,
to add anything. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to ask Jamie, how did she get the records on what she wrote about? How did you get the
build
police
that
department to
trust?
open up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the records haven't been released. She had to earn
haven't.
that trust. Yeah.
I really can't claim that much credit. I mean, I tried everything I could think of, multiple records requests. I had, as you guys know, my husband, Steve Thompson.
I was on the team with her husband, and I saw Steve trying to get all the records, so I know she didn't get them.
Trying. And then, it was actually Tanya Iser and Jason Trahan and their lawyers really went to bat trying to get these records. And they tried a series of arguments, one of which ultimately stuck. So by the time I got records, I had already essentially sourced the whole story. I mean, I just basically went person to person to person and collected their stories. And it was really a fascinating process to then get the records and see videos and other, and hear audio recordings, because it was just sort of an interesting experiment in how accurate people's memories are. And I found some people like incredibly accurate and others not so much, so it, but yeah, I can't claim a records victory there. Sorry.
But how did you earn that trust? Because that is something, and that's having talk about a thin line to walk, because the cops don't always like the way that we cover when we cover them hard. They don't always love it, and I know DPD. I obviously don't have the same relationship with them that you do, but I know that it took an enormous amount of work to build up that trust with these guys to get them to open up to you like they did. So how, any tips for that? Because it is really hard to do that.
It was really hard. And you're exactly right. Cops are not fans of reporters. They don't like journalists. I think sometimes cops are so laser focused on their own point of view that they really have a lot of problems with how we report on crime and various things. So, I mean, it was a slow process. I started really wanting to figure out what had happened inside El Centro with the SWAT team. Very, very little was released about that. There were no records to get. So I just started reaching out to SWAT members. I didn't have a lot of police sources. I wasn't a police reporter at the time. And it really went one person to another. I think it was 9 months before I got the first officer to meet with me. And then after that, he introduced me to someone, and then they introduced me to someone. And it was this very slow burn. And I think it was just one of those stories where, we all find stories every day that we are sort of interested in, and you just get the one that you just can't stop thinking about. And I think that's kind of what you have to end up in that spot, just to keep going back, in a process that doesn't always seem like it's going to be fruitful.
Well, I was curious to ask you also, with everything that's gone on this summer, with the protests, with the George Floyd, everything that's gone on, and kind of some of the outrage about police and the calls for police reform, have you talked to those guys about it a little bit? Have you heard from them? I kind of wondered what they were telling you in the background.
Yeah, so I'm in touch with pretty much everyone still. And it was a little nerve-wracking. I finished the book in January, and then we have so much movement on this topic and so many things happening that it felt a little scary to be releasing a book in this area that was not addressing the moment, you know, George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and all of these really anguishing cases. But I think, you know, in talking to them, it was interesting because I was reading the Dallas papers and watching the news. Mm-hmm. The dispatches I would get from the cops, they were like coming from a different universe. It was like, you know, you'd read in the paper, everything was peaceful and lovely. And then they would send me messages about, you know, having to like, you know, strategically get downtown to where 2 patrol officers had gotten trapped in a car and protesters were trying to set it on fire. There was like these very like warring narratives of what actually was going on. So I think that, and I think Dallas, you know, everyone is suffering from some amount of PTSD still, I think, from 2016. Ambush. So I think it's still really nerve-wracking for them to be out on the streets out there.
They're sensitive about it.
Yeah.
Obviously. One thing I wanted to ask you guys, because I think we all get inspired by really great reporting or good books, and you guys all have these great articles you've done and good books coming, some are just coming out, and some you've done in the past. What is, thinking on the genre of crime, justice, law, or injustice, my favorite topic, what is your favorite work? Article, book, magazine, even podcast, but just what's a favorite one that really stuck with you? I think of this because this is something Neil asked me when he was talking to me about this panel. Doug, you want to go first?
Sure, I'll go way back. My favorite is In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. And I know that's, you know, everyone is, it's been documented that there were tremendous problems with that, and he apparently fabricated a lot of it, and you know,
he was a bit of a fabulous, but fabulous he was.
But I read that book when I was, I don't know, 12, 13, somewhere in there, and that's what made me want to go into journalism, and especially criminal justice journalism. I mean, that set the way for me, and you know, I never looked back. So that's why that has stayed my favorite.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of David Simon's Homicide, you know, Life in the Street.
That's a great book.
That's a good
one. I remember, I worked at the Sun Goes to Show You My Judgment. We worked kind of in the same aisle in the newsroom, and I remember hearing him talk about doing the book. Like he was going to take a year off and follow the homicide squad in Baltimore City. And I remember thinking, I never said anything, but I remember thinking, it feels like a book that's been done before, right? It felt like another true crime thing, but he brought such a fresh perspective to it, kind of listened, again, you know, for those kind of quirky out there details, you know, and just kind of, I think, drove home kind of things that at least I never thought about would be part of, you know, a homicide detective's life. So that's been my favorite, and the writing was fabulous, and obviously it launched David into another orbit.
All reporters love The Wire. We love The Wire.
I asked them, you know, do you need a partner on this? I just missed my moments there.
We're like, we can tell some Baltimore stories, right? Yeah, you and David together. Jamie, how about you?
Yeah, it's funny, Michael. I read that beginning of Homicide again recently, and that opening is just one of the greatest openings. It is so full of voice. It's funny though, you ask, I'm blanking on my favorite sort of true crime, but I just recently reread Beloved by Toni Morrison.
Yeah.
And I think that it's interesting to read it right now because we're having such serious conversations about race. And I felt like that hit me emotionally in a way a lot of the journalism has not hit me. You know, I think that there's something about reading her writing. You just feel like you're stepping into this quickly moving stream and you're carried off into this world. And if you haven't read that lately, I'd definitely recommend that again.
Good time to revisit that one. This came up because Neil asked me one of the, you know, what did I love? And it was actually a book I was assigned to read in college, and I, you know, didn't know much about it, but it actually is part of the reason I became a reporter, because you know, this is a conference for narrative nonfiction. Marianne Voeller's Ghosts of Mississippi, about the murder of Medgar Evers. It was the first time I'd read a history book that was really written by a journalist that was just vivid and just got me from the get-go. And I, you know, was young enough that I didn't know enough about Medgar Evers and his work and his death and all the stuff that happened around that case. And it made me think, well, this journalism thing could be pretty damn cool. You mix it up with history, that could be, I could get into that. You know, and that was many years before I ever did investigative reporting, but that's one that I always think of. And I think it's even hard. I was looking for another copy of it on Amazon for a friend the other day, and it can get hard to get to, but there's been so much good work done. But I appreciate you guys throwing out some favorites, because I know this is a conference where we like to talk about writing and reading and all the fun things. On that note, I always think of stories that, you know, there's so many good stories in the world, and there's so many great stories we all want to tell. And I know for most reporters, there's one that's like in the back of your mind, and you probably just can't get to it because all the things that are going on and all the things, all the work you have to do in life. What is a story, big or little, you know, it could be a feature, it could be an investigation, that you would like to see told about this topic, about criminal justice, crime, policing, all these things, that you haven't seen told yet, and you think it needs to be told, and you're offering it up to all the bright young minds of Mayborn and the ambitious journalists to think, I want to see this story. I always like to ask writers this, because you never know what you're going to hear. So, Michael, you want to go first?
You know, one thing that I'd like to see done well, and I don't know how to do it. I don't know if it could really be done. I'd like to read a real in-depth piece about, say, a Black prosecutor in a city like Baltimore, like maybe a line prosecutor, and kind of what, you know, kind of their daily decisions, like what's like when they go home, kind of what they hear in their community, what they confront on the job, and just kind of all of the sort of the things they're buffeted with. That's something that I've thought about in the past, but I never fully pursued it, and never really had knew the right subject, you know, that would sort of open up. That's something I'd be interested in.
That's a great
I love
idea.
that idea, Michael. That's such a good idea.
That could be a really good, complicated, complex, nuanced story. So young writers, you're welcome. Now you have a great idea from Michael Fletcher. Jamie?
You know, I think the topic that is most interesting to me right now is drug enforcement. I think like a lot of these controversial police practices are coming from how we police drugs, no knock warrants, stop and frisk. And I think that moving forward, I think that it's going to be interesting to see how departments rethink that, and how lawmakers and how us as communities rethink that. How are we going to police drugs? What do we think about drugs? Because I think if you're talking about police reform, that's going to have to be addressed.
Doug, how about you?
I'm going to piggyback on Michael's a little bit. I'd like to see a reporter embed himself or herself in the courthouse for a year, because yeah, it's a public place, but it's a place of mystery to just about everybody who's not actually involved, who's not a lawyer or somehow involved, or a police officer. You know, most people have no idea what goes on in the prosecutor's office, and the public defender's office, and the grand jury, and the courtroom. And it's just, as we all know, because we've been there, it's a fascinating place. It's full of 1,000 stories, probably 1,000 stories a day. But if you could just get in there and get off your deadline pressure and spend 6 months, 9 months, a year, you know, I think you would come out with just some fantastic tales about how this system works and doesn't work.
That's basically what I always liked doing when I didn't have another story I was working on, is just go sit in court and go sit in the courthouse and go sit on some trials. And you're right. It's such and I wonder now, with court being on Zoom, like what's lost by that, you know, they're trying to make it accessible, but it is not always a very accessible system. It's very Byzantine. Like you're saying, it's a mystery. Most people walk in the courthouse. I think about this all the time because we write about injustice and kind of these systemic structural things that keep people in the system or keep them in poverty a lot at the Marshall Project. And that's something I did a lot of at the Morning News. But it struck me the very first time I went to the big Dallas County Courthouse near downtown. There's not even, I mean, you've got to pay to park anywhere near there. And so these are people who are trying their damnedest to pay for like a traffic ticket or this and that. And the only free parking is the bail bondsman agency. So if you go get your, you know, very expensive bail bondman and then pay a fee, then you get to park for free. But it's just little things like that, those little details you get by going and showing up, that I wonder what we're missing by everything doing on Zoom. You know, it's a different experience being a young reporter these days. Maybe we'll get back, if everyone wears their mask, then we can get this embedded courthouse story. So
no, I teach journalism at the University of Pittsburgh now, and I tell my students to just go down and sit in municipal court for a day and see the stories that come rolling through there, the truancies and the evictions. I mean, these are real low stakes cases, but they're tremendous stories full of drama and people at the end of their rope, and I mean, the stories just come pouring out of places like that.
Yeah. Well, I think that we've covered a lot of topics today that we wanted to get through. Thank you guys so much for your time. I can't wait to read all of the books and all the things. I think this has been a really interesting, fun conversation for me to talk to you great writers, and just, it's an important topic. It's something that's near and dear to my heart. I've spent a lot of time working on these issues and trying to dig at those records and dig them out. And if you had one piece of advice for people that want to tackle these big, tough topics, just big thing, and I always, it can be something you learned from failure, something you learned from doing it right, or finally perfecting it. What is your one best piece of advice for all the writers that want to dive into this murky stuff? I mean, other than just sitting at the courthouse, that's always a great piece of advice, but for just any little tidbit that you've learned that you think could be helpful to other writers for they want to tackle something tough, or even just a little, courthouse story.
It's funny. I think that we as storytellers, we spend a lot of time thinking that we want a story with a hero and a villain. We want the hero's journey. We want the tragic tale. But I think I've learned through my career that to really lean into the gray, like that's where the most interesting stories and truths are, that in that messy, complicated middle ground. And so I'd say sort of don't let those go by because they, you're seeking for the extreme. There's a lot of good in the gray.
Yeah, I would have to, piggyback on that, Jamie. That's where the best stories are. And I think the thing to do is, really dive in. Don't think about diving in, dive in. And when you're in, really talk to people and talk to unlikely people, right? Just have conversations. If there's one thing I observed, like in the newsroom for young reporters, I think now with the internet, there's always material you can mine kind of remotely, and you always can get the stuff for a story. But there's nothing to replace kind of that human conversation, at least in my opinion. That those conversations where you go in like seeking A and B, then the person happens to mention C. And that becomes the better story. So I would say dive in, talk to everybody, kind of be a presence, and you'd be surprised what you come up with.
Yeah, I agree with what you both said. I get out of the office and get lost. That's always my advice. Don't go in with certainty. Go in there and dive in so deep that you're confused for a while. And that's how I think the best stories emerge.
I have a quick question before we wrap for Doug. Yes. Doug, it's funny, before my book came out, one of the pieces of advice somebody gave me was go on Amazon, search your favorite books that you really admire, and then read the 1 and 2 star reviews because it'll make you feel better about your reviews.
Right.
And I love your book. And I went on there and looked at your reviews, which are overwhelmingly glowing and awesome. But it's funny though, what Carrie said, you have written about this iconic, beloved institution, and there are some truly funny reviews.
I'm gonna go read these reviews.
There is no shortage of people on Amazon wanting to talk about what an idiot I am.
They're really mad that you wrote
everyone's got an opinion
about the Rangers, and I was really curious, do you read the reviews? Do you think about them? How do you process?
Sometimes, not always. If I'm feeling really happy with myself, I go on there and read those reviews. I don't know. My favorite was it in Amazon. It was on this Texas Rangers Facebook page, and someone said I was a Yankee professor with a man bun and skinny jeans. And as you can see, there's no man bun here.
Whoa! Hey,
man bun. And my baggy dad jeans are the joke of the family. So that didn't apply. But
they had a picture of you. They went in with a picture of you, and they didn't know. They assumed. Oh man! Well, you guys, this has been so great. This is like I just got invited to the best damn book club ever. So thank you for letting me crash. This has been really fun chatting with y'all. Thank you guys for sticking with us. If you've made it all the way to the end of this Zoom, we appreciate you. Maybe if everyone wears their masks, we can do this in person next year. but I could not have asked for a better conversation with wonderful people. So thank you guys, and hopefully you enjoyed it and learned a little
Thank
bit.
you for moderating, Carrie.
Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you, Carrie.